When people ask, what was the American Civil War about? Um, there's so many different cultural impacts, depending on what region of the country you're in. Depends. Sometimes we do have the lost cause. Um, it's kind of lingering around. You have people sometimes in the South who will say that it wasn't about slavery, and even other parts of the country. They constantly remind us that, well, the United States practiced slavery and people from the North brought slaves over in earlier times, and that's true, but the Civil War was without a doubt fought, and the central cause of it was slavery. Yeah, you can't get around that fact. I mean, there were other factors that branched off of the problem of slavery, such as states' rights and property rights and representation in Congress, new territory that was up for grabs, and was going to, was it going to be slave territories or um, free territories? But all these issues revolved around slavery. If it wouldn't have been for slavery, none of these issues would have even happened. And we talked about in our last lecture what kind of brought slavery back on the forefront in the 19th century with Eli Whitney's cotton gin, and now all of a sudden it's slavery is exploding again. Even with Thomas Jefferson's when he and Congress passed the ban or the Non-Importation Act in 1808, there were still ways around it. Even though it was illegal to import slaves, you could still trade slaves within the United States. And there was, of course, smuggling slaves, and of course, children who were born to slave families were forever enslaved. So basically, slavery just started to sustain itself, and by birthing new slaves, that's the way slavery increased during the 19th century, again, along with some smuggling. But nonetheless, the conflict was fought over slavery. And there were other problems splitting the country in the early 19th century during the Antebellum period. You had a lot of technological breakthroughs that kind of redefined the economy and industry in the United States. We moved from local and provincial living to, where you had artisans and skilled craftsmen and women, working the old putting out system where they would make the clothing and the goods in their home and then send it somewhere else. We became commercialized. Steamboats and locomotives, telegraph wires, canals, all these things connected the United States. Interchangeable parts and machinery, better factory systems, the division of labor kind of put some of those artisans and craftsmen who used to do things by hand. Now, thanks to all those things I just mentioned, along with interchangeable parts, sped up the process of commerce, sped up the process of business. Now I don't need to pay a craftsman to come in and fix something when it breaks down. I got a machine that can do it, or I got some interchangeable parts and I can just plug it back in or hook it back up and it's ready to go. So it reshaped the look of the country. So there was a little bit of class conflict. You started to get, even though all wages rose overall in the 19th century, you did start to get a little bit of class resentment. And you started getting some very, very wealthy, eventually we'd call them captains of industry, but they were still better off than they were in Europe. Other issues, social Great Awakening, the Second Great Awakening, reformers and the revivalists that started off in Western New York. I mean, they put down alcoholism and other things that they thought were immoral, but they also picked up on slavery. They linked up with women's rights reformers such as Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton. You had your temperance people who preached against alcoholism, and you had all your perfectionist societies and your moral improvers and all that. Immigrants were pouring into the United States. At the beginning of the 19th century, we had a population about the size of Ireland. By the 1860s, we had more people than Britain. So population just skyrocketed because of the availability of land, economic opportunity, constant wars in the 19th century. Those wars for revolution in the 19th century during that so-called concert of Europe. But nonetheless, there were all types of different problems going on in the 19th century and other reasons why the country became kind of, sectionalized. But the biggest problem was slavery. And then when we started expanding territory, first with the annexation of Texas, or Louisiana Purchase, initially annexation of Texas, after the Mexican-American War, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, the question became what was to become of those new territories, whether they be slave states or free states. And of course, you had your abolitionists in the North, and the congressmen, and even the people who weren't abolitionists, who didn't necessarily want slavery to end. They just wanted it to not move into new territories, were concerned about representation in Congress. They knew that if the slave owners in the South got their way and slavery made its way into the new territories, that those states would probably elect pro-slavery people to Congress, and they would undermine what they're trying to do in the northern manufacturing sector. People in the South who were more agricultural, they were more inclined to support lower tariffs, so they could ship out their cotton all over the world for lower prices, because typically other countries, if you raised your tariffs, they would respond by raising theirs. Northern industrialists wanted to obviously have higher tariffs to protect their industry from imports, so you had a little bit of an economic divide there as well. But really, it started to become, especially with the Second Great Awakening reformers and your abolitionists, William Lloyd Garrison, of course, Frederick Douglass, who, as he said, stole himself from slavery, the Angelina, Sarah Grimke, John Brown. There's so many people that you can name. There was a lot of people who started to question the moral side of slavery and the hypocrisy of a country that was founded all men created equal, yet here we are harboring a massive institution of slavery. So slavery was no question the biggest problem that we had, even with some other discriminatory action in the early 19th century, when you had the influx of Irish Catholic immigrants and Eastern European immigrants who were not Protestant, spoke a different language. You did have some issues there as well, but slavery was no question the biggest problem that we had, and it was the absolute core cause of the American Civil War. And it should be noted that a lot of people, shame the entire United States. But it has to be understood that slavery, the fight to end slavery, began as soon as the United States was created. Benjamin Franklin was an abolitionist, and he actually created one of the first abolitionist groups as far back as the colonization period, when you had the founding of Rhode Island, which was slavery was prohibited there by Roger Winthrop. Not Roger Winthrop, but Roger Williams, I'm sorry. But nonetheless, the fight over slavery, it was complex, and it was all over the world. It wasn't just unique to the Americas. It was an ugly institution that was being eliminated, and it had to be a fight to eliminate slavery all over the developed world. There's some places even now that tolerate slavery. And it was a complicated institution in itself. Most slaves were treated terribly. They were whipped, they were beaten, some of them were even killed. But when in the 19th century, when the importation of slavery was banned, and most of the plantation owners had to, birth new slaves, they had to take care of them a little bit better. They knew they were a hot commodity. They were high demand. No longer could you just import slaves from somewhere else, even though you could smuggle them, but you were running a risk of a federal crime. So by the 19th century, there was an improvement in treatment in a lot of places, all things considered. There were some slave narratives that were written as part of that Federal Writers Project during the New Deal, where some slaves described a very interesting mix of stories. Some of them talked about how they were treated very poorly, treated like a dog. One of them said he would rather take a gun and just end it all before going back to slavery. He said, because you're nothing but a dog. But some slaves described they had it pretty decent. They had churches and even got to go to dances that the slave owner would put on for them. Some of them were house servants. Some of them had relationships with the slave owners' families and kids, and some of their kids even played together. One of them talked about eating biscuits and brandy on several occasions, but most of the treatment was bad. But understand, it was a complicated institution that wasn't just about economics. It was also about a social control and a social network that was created in the South. After the indentured servitude policy, faded out in the 17th century, we went to African slavery, and it became race-based. Some of the more middle class, I guess you could say, white landowners who got land after the indentured servitude policy went away, there started being clashes, class warfare, and that threatened the stability of the South. So creating African slavery kind of created a captive workforce for the plantation owners, and they weren't a threat to, the middle class non-slave owners who also got some tracts of land as well. So it was really about controlling the social structure in the South as well. But most of the treatment was poor. Many slaves, the average slave that was born was less than 5 pounds. Pregnant women who were enslaved and they had to pick right up to the day they were going through labor. They had quotas in the fields, and they had to pick a certain amount of cotton. And a lot of plantations, not all of them, and if they didn't, however many pounds short they were, that's how many lashes they got. If you were 100 pounds short, you got 100 lashes. Some slaves were whipped so bad and had so much skin torn from their bones that they actually contracted severe diseases, and some of them passed away from sepsis and stuff like that. Many slaves, especially earlier times, had all kinds of diseases such as tuberculosis, malaria, typhoid fever. A lot of them had worms. It was just a wretched living in a lot of places. But the issue of slavery is, without a doubt, the central core cause of the Civil War. And it kind of brings up another interesting point about how we reflect on the Civil War. What it was really about. It wasn't just a heroic struggle on the battlefield, which is, in a lot of places what people think of it as now. Some people fly their rebel flags, and we have all these Civil War reenactments and these statues commemorating the glory on the battlefield. And it has kind of glossed over in a lot of people's minds what the Civil War was really about, and that was liberating millions of people who were held in bondage. That was, as Abraham Lincoln said, it was about a new birth of freedom in the United States. It was about the United States finally becoming what we were intended to be. Now, the 13th Amendment that abolished slavery certainly did not end the struggle for civil rights. We would certainly see the resurgence of white terror in the South throughout the late 19th, all the way into the middle and a little bit further of the 20th century. So slavery was a central core cause, no matter how you want to approach it. Slavery was the issue, and it could no longer survive in this country. And we're going to talk about in our next lecture, we're going to get on into the 19th century politics, how we tried to patchwork and frame up policies that would kind of hopefully sweep the issue of slavery under the rug. But nonetheless, the discussion's main point today was slavery was without a doubt the main cause of the Civil War.